Di will make sweeping generalizations and draw simplistic conclusions about women, men, and the world. Are you ready? And after you're not Jan, you're Di. After Di, Jan Greenwood will follow with her observations on women in our culture. She will also talk about a time when she became aware of International Women's Day and the women's movement as it moves forward. Thank you, Di and Jan.
Right, my 5 minutes of sweeping generalization starts now. The oppression of women is the most universal injustice the world has ever known, and most of the other evils of human society arise from it. So, fix it, and we fix the world. We're the only species that hates half of its own kind. To be born female in almost all societies is at best a disappointment, and at worst a disaster. And female babies are still aborted and murdered in parts of the world, leading to wildly skewed gender ratios. Those who survive are at risk. They know they're loved less and valued less, and they're likely to be forced into marriage or sold into prostitution. In evolutionary terms, this is bonkers, but religions do like tidy opposites, believers and non-believers, saved and damned, white and black, men and women. So women are confined in most societies, traditionally, to the domestic sphere, while men own the public sphere. And this makes it almost impossible for friendship between the sexes. It's like racial segregation, but of course, everybody is born into the women's world, and that's where they acquire language and assumptions and beliefs and cultures and their world view. Then, of course, boys are extracted from that world and have to spend the rest of their life proving how masculine they are by proving that by distancing themselves from everything female and feminine in the hunt or the battlefield or the boardroom, and also in sexual exploitation, sexual violence. And as we know, this can lead to hatred of LGBTQ people, that's fairly obvious, and environmental destruction and everything we term toxic masculinity. Think Trump, think Putin, think Taliban. But change is happening. We've all seen dramatic changes in our own lifetimes, and there are plenty of women in public life in most cultures now. Here in Canada, they're very well represented in law, medicine, science, politics. But those institutions are still masculine focused. They're hierarchical, linear, left brain biased, competitive and often adversarial. They will change over time. And there's nothing wrong with traditional masculine values, providing they're balanced with cooperation, compromise, and empathy. More difficult to change are religions. After all, they claim to represent eternal and immutable truth. It's very difficult to admit that on some things they've been wrong for thousands of years. How much easier, for instance, to blame paedophilia in the Catholic priesthood on a few bad apples rather than a deeply flawed attitude to sex. In the West, people...
One second, we're just going to reconnect the microphone.
This seems
And just when I thought we were going to have a whole service with no tech issues, and we have a tech issue. So thank you for bearing with us.
Sorry for the interruption.
No problem. How are we doing? Yay! Okay, so in the West, people are leaving conventional religions in their droves. Some for atheism, some for nature-based spirituality, and about 25% declare themselves to be spiritual but not religious. They should, of course, be flocking to the Unitarianism. We have an excellent track record on equality, our first principle, and it was a Unitarian, Mary Wollstonecraft, who wrote The Vindication of the Rights of Women in 1792. So yes, change is all around us, but for improvement to be meaningful and irreversible, it has to be generational change. Change in assumptions, language, worldview. Duh! That's overwhelmingly what women do, what women can do. They're responsible for the background, attitude and values of the next generation, after all. And actually, it's not just women these days, at least in our culture. Fathers play a far greater role in the care of small children than they used to. And I'm delighted that my little grandchildren are learning their worldview from their dad as well as from their mum. So I'm hopeful we shall see an increase in balanced both and thinking that recognises differences and connectedness. The Dalai Lama famously said, "The world will be saved by the Western woman." And just to use one rather masculine metaphor to end up with, the ultimate weapon in our armoury, the one thing that overcomes all forms of prejudice and discrimination, is friendship.
Well, none of us have talked to each other. Can you hear me? None of us had talked to each other about what we were going to say. We had a little blurb that we read. So you'll hear some repetition in what I'm going to say, and I'm going to have to leave a little bit out because there's so much to talk about. What does IWD mean to me was the question we were asked. To me, it is a symbol of the need for change. Thanks, Di, for talking about change and what's going on. I'm going to go through a little bit about my life because it's very personal. As a young girl, I noticed that most boys had more prestige and authority than girls had. Another girl would indignantly talk about how a sport or event was not allowed because she was a girl. In my case, I wasn't allowed to play cricket. The boys would say, "Go away, this is a boys' game." At the same time, my grandmother and her cohorts worked in an airplane development and research factory nearby. Next door, on the big farm, older girls worked the farmland as land girls, driving tractors and herding animals, which really appealed to me. These were among the women who took up the slack until the surviving men came home from war. And that's another whole topic, conflict and how it affects women. And Kai, this was something that I thought about, and I really appreciate what you said. It's evident there is oppression of people in the spectrum of gender identity, and I was wondering how someone who identifies as other than female or male considers this on IW Day, so I hope we'll talk about it. Di, I think, mentioned misogyny. I don't know if you used the word, but it underlies so much of what we're talking about. And for me, it was a painful realization when I saw the extent that this belief and from where it came, that women were less than and inferior, and ingrained dislike of women carried out by men. So I'm a young adult now, and on a Canadian census, I added a note declaring there was no category for my contribution to the economy, the GNP, Gross National Product. With some other women, I considered my work at home a domestic engineer. A little bit tongue-in-cheek, but you know, it was real stuff. As a registered nurse in charge on evening shift, it rankled that the male orderly was paid more than we RNs were paid. Activist individuals and groups have persisted in gradually obtaining improvements in pay and working conditions, but not yet for all. In Canada in the 1880s, the woman question. What was the woman question? Well, there was a big fuss about how could women be included in university education in Toronto? The woman question. So there's been a lot of resistance to change, which is what I am looking for. Those who speak up about these issues have and still are dubbed with derogatory names, other offensive language which was meant to silence them. The actions of many women moved and encouraged me. Lotta Hitchmanova, some of you know, is one of my heroes. She was an activist with the Unitarian Service Committee and described her commitment to help World War II refugees. She was criticized for this. She herself was a refugee. I saw her, and by then television in my life had appeared. I saw her and marveled at her strength and perseverance. Until the 1960s, IWD movement was largely a socialist communist campaign, and I heard about it as the second wave of the women's rights movement was sweeping across North America and Europe. This day, it reemerged as a day of activism. And this is a quote: "Women's groups were joined by leftists and labor organizations in calling for equal pay, economic opportunity, legal rights, right to vote, family planning, subsidized daycare, childcare, and the prevention of violence against women." Some women were not permitted to vote till much after, many years later, after land-owning men were allowed to vote. And I've got a button here today, which I've got many buttons, and I've rifled through this jar that I have, and this one says something like, "I am a woman, watch me vote." I've only missed one day to vote in my life, because I think it's so important. There were other women besides Lotta: Gloria Steinem, Betty Friedan, Susan B. Anthony, Judy Chicago, and before my time, Anna Elizabeth Wilson, who was the first editor of the Canadian Chatelaine magazine. I read Chatelaine and Ms. magazines because I was a woman working at home, mostly in those young days as with my kids. I searched for ways to find information that was not the general sweeping across the media. And I found in those two magazines, and other readings of course, in-depth commentary on subjects ignored in most media. I mentioned armed conflict, and I won't even go into the statistics. Some examples. What is the time? Oh, that's not it.
You're good.
Yeah, you're fine.
Okay.
You're good.
Examples of the, I call it examples of the ongoing mess that we're in as humans. Tehran, India in 2007. International Women's Day sparked violence when police beat hundreds of women and men who were planning to rally. They weren't in a rally yet. In Iran right now, shocking, despicable situations have arisen about poisoning of young women. This, I believe, and has been commented on, is meant to frighten women in order to silence them. Cairo, Egypt in 1956, a new law which forbade, I better read what I've written because I'll screw up. It was forbidden in law to discriminate against women and their right to work. Then in the 2020s, still in Egypt, a crackdown declared women must have male approval to be married and go on the streets. Hundreds of men came not to support, but to harass the women standing up for their rights. Well, the police and military stood by watching, doing nothing to stop the crowds of men. In 1965, and this is when I still was mostly at home with the children, when police were called to a neighbor's house where a man was beating his wife, the reply was, "This is a domestic issue, not for police intervention." Thank God some of that has changed and improved. You all have heard of Malala Yousafzai. As a child, She was and is now still famous for her activism, and in those days, at the age of 14, she rose up against Pakistani Taliban ban on girls' education. In Canada, the red dress symbolizes the loss of murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls. More recent movements, Me Too and Time's Up. Me Too wants changes against sexual abuse, sexual harassment, and rape culture. And Time's Up is a fight for a future where no one is harassed, assaulted, discriminated against at work. These things that I've mentioned go along with our principle about justice and equity. All this has given me a grasp of the struggle for other individuals and groups seeking fair treatment. I don't think I have sat and so carefully thought through my own life, because I was asked to do this personally, but sat and thought through my own life and all of the examples of inequities and biases in writings, in television, in my family and my friends. So I'm grateful for the opportunity. So the challenge all this provides is for us to be aware and willing to speak out with our daughters, granddaughters, neighbors, and friends, and those we have not yet met. Thank you.